I have spent most of my career in places people never see. Hospitals advertise light, cleanliness, reassurance. What keeps that illusion intact is hidden below, in layers of infrastructure that are rarely questioned as long as they function. Ventilation systems, pressure controls, return air paths. They are not dramatic systems, but they are unforgiving. When they fail, bodies notice before instruments do. Before we go any deeper, take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from and whether you've ever heard anything like this yourself. Hit that like button and subscribe. Thanks. By the time I was assigned to that hospital, I had already worked in trauma centers, research facilities, and long-term care complexes built in the middle of the last century. I understood how older buildings behave when they're kept alive past their original design. They do not decay evenly. They develop habits. Certain corridors stay warmer than schematics predict. Air moves where it was never meant to. Nothing about that surprises me anymore. This hospital was large, urban, and layered. It had grown outward and downward over decades, absorbing older structures, sealing off what could not be economically updated. Beneath the active levels were service corridors, mechanical rooms, and pressure regulation chambers that still mattered even if no one visited them anymore. Air cannot be allowed to stagnate in a hospital. Not anywhere. My role was straightforward. A recent upgrade to several surgical floors required validation that downstream pressure remained stable, especially in zones below the morgue and pathology labs. It was not unusual for changes above to introduce subtle imbalances below. I was brought in because I specialized in those interactions. I knew where problems liked to hide. I worked nights whenever possible. Fewer people, fewer variables. At night, a hospital settles into its true rhythm. The demand for oxygen stabilizes. Doors open less frequently. Elevators run predictably. From an engineering perspective, it is the cleanest time to observe a system. The lower levels were accessed through a service elevator that descended past public floors and into spaces marked only by alphanumeric codes. The air changed almost immediately. Warmer, drier, carrying traces of disinfectant and something older underneath. Not unpleasant, just persistent. The walls were a combination of sealed concrete and polymer panels installed during different renovation phases. Some surfaces reflected light too well, others absorbed it completely. I moved methodically. Measure, log, move on. Pressure differentials across thresholds were within acceptable tolerances. Vent speeds held steady. Return flow was uninterrupted. Everything suggested a system doing exactly what it was designed to do, even if the design itself belonged to another era. I was not alone, at least on paper. An engineering intern was assigned to assist, mostly to observe. He followed when instructed, carried equipment, and stayed quiet. That suited me. I prefer silence when I am working. Communication introduces noise, and noise leads to assumptions. Access to certain corridors required coordination with hospital staff. A senior nurse on the night shift facilitated entry where necessary. She had worked there long enough to treat the lower levels as a nuisance rather than a curiosity. For administrative oversight, a night manager monitored our progress remotely. Everything was professional, procedural, controlled. That is important to state clearly. Nothing about the early phase of this job felt wrong. The physical effort was moderate but constant. Narrow passages, low ceilings, long walks between monitoring points. I paid attention to my breathing the way I always do in enclosed spaces. Not out of fear, but calibration. Your body reacts to air quality long before instruments register change. It is a professional habit to notice. The sounds were minimal. A continuous background of airflow through ducts, punctuated by the occasional vibration as pressure dampers adjusted automatically. Footsteps echoed briefly and then disappeared. Light behaved imperfectly. Fluorescent fixtures aging at different rates, some casting a faint hum, others flickering just enough to register peripherally. Time passed evenly. I marked hours by task completion rather than clocks. When you work underground long enough, circadian cues lose relevance. You learn to trust routine instead. By the end of the first night, I had no concerns worth escalating. The data supported that conclusion. I logged recommendations, scheduled a follow-up inspection for areas that warranted longer observation, and left through the same elevator I had arrived in. Surface air felt cooler, heavier with moisture. Normal city air. If I am precise, there was one minor observation I noted only mentally. In one corridor beneath the morgue, I found myself pausing longer than necessary before moving on. Not because of equipment or readings, because I felt the need to take a deeper breath than usual. At the time, I attributed it to posture, fatigue, the warmth of that section. The explanation fit easily, and I accepted it without resistance. Experience teaches you not to invent problems. It also teaches you that systems rarely fail loudly. They change subtly, and they do so long before anyone believes them capable of it. Looking back now, with distance and unwanted clarity, I can say that the first night contained everything already. Nothing had announced itself. Nothing demanded attention. The environment behaved as expected. The routine held, and yet my body had already begun adjusting, without instruction, to something it could not yet define. The second night followed the same structure as the first. Same access points, same equipment, same planned route with minor adjustments to focus on zones that had registered borderline readings. Consistency matters in my field. If you want to notice deviation, you remove as many variables as possible. The intern was present again, quieter than before. He looked tired, which I attributed to the schedule. Night work does that quickly if you're not used to it. The nurse signed us through without comment. The administrator confirmed our window and reminded me to log any anomalies, his tone neutral and procedural. Nothing in that should have stood out. At the time, none of it did. What changed was not the environment in any measurable way, but my awareness of my own physical responses within it. I noticed my breathing sooner, not because it was labored, but because it felt slightly out of step with my movement. When I walked, my steps and breaths no longer aligned as cleanly as they normally do. It was subtle enough that I questioned whether I was imagining it. In enclosed spaces, especially warm ones, the body often unconsciously regulates intake to compensate for perceived air quality. I had experienced that many times before. The correction usually happens automatically. This did not. In a long service corridor beneath pathology, I stopped to recalibrate a handheld sensor. The moment I became still, I felt an unfamiliar pause in my chest. Not a lack of air, not discomfort, just a brief suspension between inhalation and exhalation that felt slightly longer than intended. I exhaled deliberately and continued working. The sensation did not return immediately. That mattered. If it had been persistent, I would have investigated further. Instead, it appeared only in moments of stillness and disappeared with motion. I tested that without acknowledging it to myself. I slowed my pace in the next corridor. Within seconds, the same pause occurred. I resumed walking, and my breathing normalized. The pattern was simple enough to rationalize. Static posture can affect diaphragm engagement. Focus can override automatic rhythms. I was spending more time stationary than usual, double-checking readings. Any number of explanations fit. I accepted one and moved on. The intern did not comment on anything. He kept his distance, watching from the threshold of rooms rather than entering fully. I corrected him once, asking him to stand closer so he could see the readings properly. He complied, but I noticed he positioned himself near the door. The air itself remained consistent. Warm, dry, faintly chemical. No changes in flow velocity. No fluctuations in pressure beyond expected tolerances. The ventilation system responded normally to adjustments above. On paper, the hospital was breathing exactly as it should. At one point, I became aware that I was holding my breath while logging data. That is not unusual either, but I made a point of releasing it slowly. As I did, I felt a brief sense of resistance, as if my exhale had to pass through a space that was already occupied. That thought occurred fully formed and then was immediately dismissed. Occupied air is not a concept that applies at that scale. Air mixes. Pressure equalizes. There is no such thing as someone else's breath lingering intact in a ventilated corridor. I have explained that to junior staff more than once. Still, the sensation left an impression. Later that night, I spoke briefly with the nurse while waiting for elevator access. She mentioned that the lower levels always felt oppressive, even after years of working there. She said it casually, without emotion. I asked her to clarify what she meant. She shrugged and said it was just the air. That aligned neatly with my working explanation. Old systems, warm zones, subconscious reactions. I did not pursue the comment further. The intern excused himself early, citing a headache. He did not look ill, just strained. I approved his departure without concern. The work did not require two people. Alone, I noticed the pauses more frequently. Each time I stopped, even briefly, my breathing seemed to hesitate before continuing. The hesitation was not identical each time, but it followed the same structure, a delay between inhale and exhale that felt externally imposed rather than internally chosen. I began adjusting my behavior to compensate. I avoided stopping abruptly. I took notes while walking. I leaned against walls only long enough to read instruments. The sensations diminished accordingly. That reinforced my belief that this was a physiological response to posture or attention. Professionals rely on reinforcement. When a hypothesis appears to work, you trust it. By the end of the night, I felt mildly fatigued in a way that was difficult to localize. Not muscle tiredness, not mental exhaustion, more like the lingering effect of conscious breathing after exercise. When I reached the surface, I took several deep breaths without intending to. The city air felt thicker, heavier, reassuring. I slept poorly the following day, not because of anxiety or nightmares, but because I kept waking during the natural pauses between breaths. Each time, there was a moment of disorientation, as if I had been waiting for something to finish before continuing. By the third shift, I was prepared to ignore it entirely. That is often how these things continue for as long as they do. By the third night, the hesitation in my breathing had become predictable. Not constant, not overpowering, but persistent in a pattern I could feel forming. It emerged only when I slowed, only in certain corridors. The more time I spent observing, the more the timing seemed to adjust to me, as if the moment itself were aware of my pause and ready to fill it. I walked deliberately this night, taking longer routes through the service levels, entering rooms I had previously skipped. My attention was divided between the instrumentation and the subtle rhythm in my chest. I measured airflow, recorded pressure differentials, and logged temperatures, but each task was punctuated by a conscious monitoring of my own breath. That monitoring alone appeared to trigger the sensation. The moment I thought about it, the pause returned, faint but unmistakable. When I focused fully on the instruments and ignored my breathing, it retreated. I began to notice variation in the effect. In one chamber beneath the morgue, it felt as if the pause preceded my inhale by a fraction of a second, anticipating it. In another corridor, under a panel of old ductwork, it followed slightly behind my exhale like a response to something I had already done. My body reacted even before my conscious mind registered the change. I tested this several times, moving deliberately and then standing still. Each time, the pattern persisted. I could no longer dismiss it as fatigue or posture, nor could I measure it with any instrument. The vents, the temperature, the pressure, all within specifications. Nothing on paper explained what my body was experiencing. The sensation was tied directly to my awareness. If I did not think about it, it was negligible. If I acknowledged it, it grew. Other people in the hospital began to recede from my world. The intern had stopped responding to calls and texts. At first, I assumed he was busy, but days passed without contact. The nurse's guidance grew curt, and she would redirect me elsewhere rather than accompany me through the lower levels. The administrator's check-ins were shorter, clipped, delayed. It was as if everyone's presence had contracted, leaving only the space and me. The corridors themselves seemed to carry memory. The familiar echo of footsteps, the hum of ductwork, even the flicker of fluorescent light fixtures became synchronized with my movement and breathing. One night, I paused near an access hatch, expecting the usual hesitation. It did not come immediately. When it arrived, it was longer than before, heavier, insistent. It responded to my anticipation, as if the system, or something within it, were aware I was expecting it. I started to avoid unnecessary stops. My workflow shifted unconsciously. I logged readings while walking, leaned minimally, and kept instruments at a distance where I could read them without pausing. The subtle sense of being accompanied, of a rhythm outside myself, dictated my behavior more than any hazard manual could. Even in this early stage, the effect was not violent. There was no threat, no sharp alert in my chest or mind. It was impossible to ignore. Awareness alone strengthened it. Recognition created resonance. I realized this shift as I watched the same corridor light flicker slightly, not from power fluctuation, but from my own focus. Every detail of the environment, once inert, now held weight. Surfaces, sounds, the slight pressure in the air, all of it mattered because I had begun to notice it. By the end of the third night, I understood that my body had learned a new rhythm. I was no longer solely breathing my own air. Something else, indefinite and patient, mirrored me. My pauses, my changes in pace, even the pattern of my steps, all invited it to exist. Recognition had created interaction, subtle, silent, and inescapable. This was the moment the lower levels stopped being merely infrastructure. They had become aware, not intelligent in any conventional sense, not malicious, but responsive, observant. The hospital was no longer just walls and ducts. It had become a space with patience, with memory, and with a quiet expectation that I would continue to participate. Even then, I was not afraid, only attentive, and that attention, I would come to learn, was the portal through which everything afterward would arrive. The fourth night changed everything in ways I could no longer rationalize. It began like all the others. I descended to the lower levels, checked the familiar panels, logged the expected airflow and pressure readings. The intern was absent again. The night manager's updates were brief, functional. The nurse gave me a cursory nod at the service elevator. Nothing unusual on the surface. I reached the pressure regulation chamber beneath the morgue, a space I had visited many times. The doors sealed with a soft pneumatic hiss, and I stepped in, taking care to keep my pace consistent. Instruments read normal. Temperature, airflow, humidity, all within specifications. Even the fluorescent light flicker was the same I had noted on previous nights. Yet as soon as I slowed to record readings, it happened. The pause came not just in my perception, but in my chest. Longer than before, deliberate, structured. I could feel it pressing against the rhythm of my own breathing. I held still for observation, deliberately resisting the urge to adjust my inhale. And then I realized this hesitation was not merely a distortion. It matched no known physiological pattern. It was a duplication of my own rhythm, but offset, a shadow of breath. I tested it, moving closer to the walls, standing in different positions, adjusting my head and torso. Each change altered its response. Closer to the duct, it synchronized more quickly. Away from the wall, slight lag. I could no longer ignore it as an artifact of fatigue or ventilation. This was contact without contact, a presence defined entirely by rhythm and my attention. My instruments could not measure it. There were no spikes, no anomalies. But my body knew. Every inhale and exhale became a negotiation. I adjusted my pace, controlled my posture, modulated my breathing, all to avoid triggering a response too intense to manage. It was still subtle, but unmistakable. I had crossed the point where I could no longer pretend that everything here was mechanical or predictable. Outside the chamber, the environment confirmed it in less tangible ways. The nurse no longer accompanied me. The administrator's responses were delayed, terse. The intern was unreachable. One by one, human connections receded. Even the routine of the hospital above ground seemed to continue in parallel, oblivious, while the lower levels had begun to enforce their own order. I realized the behavioral confirmation was twofold. First, the presence itself was undeniable. It responded to attention, modulated to my behavior, shaped by recognition. Second, my own adaptation became part of the evidence. How I moved, how I breathed, how I lingered or passed through, all became measurable by the sensation, even though no physical measurement existed. It was impossible to mark a line between environment and entity. The walls, the ducts, the fluorescent light, and the vibration of the air all seemed to store and replay interaction. The hospital had learned my routines. My pauses, my hesitations, my inhalations, all had consequences. And yet, nothing attacked. Nothing chased me. There was no danger in the conventional sense. But the knowledge that my rhythm was no longer purely mine changed the stakes. I could not stop the recognition from happening. It was created the instant I acknowledged the pattern. When I exited the chamber and made my way back to the service elevator, I knew with certainty that my relationship to the hospital had altered. The lower levels had left their mark, indelibly, in ways that could not be erased by leaving. I had reached the point of no return. I had confirmed it physically, behaviorally, and psychologically. Something within the structure of the hospital was now aware of me. I had seen its effect on my own body. Instruments were irrelevant. Rules and specifications no longer mattered. The building, or whatever it had become, had noted me and remembered. By the fifth night, the understanding of my place in the hospital had shifted entirely. I no longer moved freely. Every step was moderated by a consciousness I could not see. The corridors, chambers, and ductwork responded subtly to my awareness. The moment I slowed, the hesitation returned. The moment I paused to take notes, it emerged again. Every action invited a reaction, not loud or violent, but undeniable. I adjusted my behavior meticulously. I walked more deliberately, timed my entries and exits, and minimized pauses. Even standing still required conscious effort. I monitored my inhale and exhale, careful not to allow the momentary suspension of breath to grow too noticeable. It was not fear, exactly, but a pervasive awareness. My body was now under observation, its rhythms no longer private. The intern never returned. Calls went unanswered, messages unread. The nurse continued to avoid the lower levels, citing routine duties, though I knew she could have escorted me. The administrator's check-ins grew briefer, more mechanical. With each absence, the hospital seemed more singular in its attentiveness. I was alone with the presence, and it demanded compliance through subtle influence rather than force. My breathing had become a negotiation. Each inhalation and exhalation required awareness, timing, and adjustment. The environment subtly shaped my decisions. How far I could linger in a chamber, which passageways I would take, how long I could pause for readings. It responded to anticipation. If I expected the pause, it often arrived slightly earlier. If I tried to ignore it, it lingered until I acknowledged it. I could not escape. The only option was adaptation. Physical details became increasingly acute. The warm, dry air pressed unevenly against my skin. The smooth polymer panels felt cooler when I brushed past them, as if absorbing my attention. The ducts vibrated faintly, in sync with my heartbeat, or so it seemed. Every sensory input carried a subtle pressure, a message I could not fully interpret. The light flickered with imperfection, casting shadows that shifted just enough to reinforce the sense of an audience. Psychologically, I was exhausting myself without realizing it, monitoring my breathing, my movements, my timing, while performing professional duties, created a constant mental strain. I would calculate how long I could pause in a room, then adjust mid-action to avoid triggering the sensation too strongly. The presence did not hurry me, but the awareness it demanded dictated the pace of everything I did. It taught me, patiently, the rules I had to follow. I began to notice reflexive changes in my physiology. My chest tightened slightly when I anticipated the pause. My throat adjusted involuntarily to maintain a consistent airflow. My attention to rhythm became instinctual. Even when I closed my eyes for a moment in an empty corridor, I could sense the presence mirroring or offsetting me. It existed as much in my body as in the space itself. And yet, there was no hostility. The experience was oppressive only in its constancy. It did not hunt. It did not harm. It merely coexisted. It reminded me that attention creates influence and recognition invites response. Each step, each breath, each choice shaped the environment subtly, and, in turn, the environment shaped me. Over time, my strategies became refined. I maintained minimal pauses, walked in controlled rhythms, and deliberately avoided eye contact with any reflective surface that might betray the space's awareness. I documented readings efficiently, prioritizing speed and flow. The hospital below ground had become a system with its own patience, capable of observing and responding over long durations. I had learned to live within its parameters. The lower levels no longer felt like spaces I owned. I was a participant in a dialogue I could not articulate. The pause in my breath, the tiny suspensions that had begun unnoticed, had grown into the defining element of my presence. I could move through the environment safely, but only by adhering to rules that were invisible, unstated, and absolute. By the end of the night, I emerged to the surface physically unscathed, instruments and readings unremarkable. But internally, I carried a new rhythm. My own breathing felt shared, layered with the subtle, patient repetition of something beyond myself. It was a quiet coexistence, unspoken, precise, and enduring. The hospital had taught me the terms of interaction, and I had no choice but to follow. The presence was patient. I was patient, and in that patience, I had become fundamentally aware of something that would outlast any shift, any schedule, any change in staff. The environment had transformed from passive structure to attentive participant, and I was inseparably intertwined with it. The last night I spent in that hospital, I moved differently from the very first ascent. Every step, every pause, every breath had become deliberate. I no longer wandered corridors without purpose. I no longer allowed myself the luxury of forgetting that something else was present, quietly synchronizing with my own rhythm. The awareness had become permanent, and I carried it like an extra limb, invisible yet insistently tangible. I completed my rounds efficiently, noting airflow, pressures, and temperatures as I always did. The instruments told me everything was within specification, exactly as it had been for years. Above ground, the hospital ran on its usual schedule. Patients were treated, nurses attended, machines hummed. All the surface appearances remained unchanged. Nothing in the world outside acknowledged the alteration beneath. Descending for the final time, I walked the familiar corridors under the morgue and pathology labs. The temperature, the dry, warm air, the subtle vibration of ducts, all were exactly as I remembered. When I paused to inspect a panel or record a reading, the hesitation in my chest appeared instantly, as it had countless times before. I had long ceased trying to adjust it. Now I simply let it exist. My body no longer fought it, it accommodated. The intern never returned. The nurse no longer accompanied me. The administrator's oversight was minimal. The lower levels were mine alone, and yet I was never truly alone. The rhythm of breath that had followed, mirrored, and sometimes anticipated mine was present with every inhale and exhale. There was no chase, no confrontation, no threat. Only the persistent, quiet insistence of awareness. I realized on that night that leaving physically changed nothing. The corridors, the rooms, the ducts, all remained attentive, holding memory of me in the spaces I had traversed. I stepped into the service elevator for the last time, feeling the familiar shift in air pressure as the cab descended. The pause in my breathing arrived as it always had, a silent acknowledgement of my presence, now permanent. Above ground, the city air felt heavier, wetter, denser in comparison. My lungs expanded with each breath, yet I could feel the echo beneath, the invisible counterpart that had grown inseparable from my own rhythm. Instruments, schedules, and staff no longer mattered. This presence had established a connection not through force, but through recognition and attention. It had been patient, intelligent in its own way, and enduring. I walked out of the building into the night. Streetlights cast their usual glare, distant traffic droned, the faint hum of the city rose and fell. My steps carried me away, yet I was already carrying the hospital's rhythm within me. Every pause and breath, every moment of stillness, every subtle hesitation reminded me that I had been observed and remembered. That connection could not be undone. Even now, years later, I am aware of it. In quiet rooms, when I slow my pace or pause in thought, I feel the same presence. It is patient, exacting, and persistent. It does not need to act to exist. Awareness itself created the bond, and I am forever a part of its rhythm. My own breathing is no longer entirely mine. I have left the hospital physically, but the quiet companion I acquired there travels with me still, and I know it will never abandon me. Each inhale reminds me. Each exhale acknowledges it. I will carry this forever.